Hey, can anyone hear me? Is this reality or the reality in which I lived for so many years? It's strange to think of your life as an experiment, isn't it? A place where every emotion you feel, every word you speak, and every gesture you make becomes data to be analyzed, dissected, and worst of all, exploited. But for 10 years, that was my reality, and I didn't even know it. I lived in a laboratory called Love, and my wife, Claire, was the scientist running the show. Let me tell you about her. Claire wasn't just the life of the party. She was the party. She was the kind of woman who could walk into a room and command everyone's attention without saying a word. People gravitated toward her, not just because of her beauty, but because she had this energy, this spark that made you feel like you were the most important person in the world when she looked at you. I was different, gentle, kind, and, as I've come to realize, hopelessly naive. Where she was vibrant, I was steady. Where she thrived on chaos, I found comfort in routine. I suppose that's what made us work. Or at least, I thought it did. Claire was a writer of short stories, a brilliant one at that. Her work was raw and emotional, the kind of stories that stayed with you long after you'd finished reading them. She found inspiration everywhere, in the people she met, the places she traveled, and the whispers of life's little dramas. Her stories often explored themes of love, betrayal, and redemption. I didn't love the betrayal part. It always left a sour taste in my mouth, but she wrote it so well that I couldn't help but admire her craft. Our life together felt comfortable, even exciting at times. Claire had a habit of taking trips to gather material for her stories. She'd come back brimming with ideas, her eyes alight with the fire of inspiration. Those were the moments I loved most, sitting together in the quiet of our living room, as she shared her newest creations with me. She'd watch my face intently as I read, waiting for the flicker of emotion in my eyes, the tear, the furrowed brow, the knowing smile. "Dylan," she'd say, grinning as I closed her manuscript. With a sigh, "You're my favorite reader. You feel everything so deeply." I'd smile back, feeling a swell of pride. It felt intimate, being the first to experience her work. It was as though we were sharing a secret, just the two of us. Looking back now, I realize how blind I was. She wasn't sharing her stories with me. She was sharing me with her stories. Every tear I shed, every ache I felt in my chest, was another layer of authenticity she could weave into her narratives. I was her muse, her experiment, and I didn't even know it. I remember one particular evening vividly. Claire had just returned from a trip to the coast. A weekend getaway, she claimed, was to find the pulse of the ocean. She came back with a story about a woman torn between her loyal, predictable husband and a mysterious stranger she met on a rainy afternoon. It was beautiful, heart-wrenching, and so vivid it almost felt real. When I finished reading it, I looked at her and said, "It's incredible, Claire. But why do you always write about betrayal? It's so painful." She laughed, a light, melodic sound that danced around the room. "Pain makes people feel alive, Dylan, don't you think?" I didn't. But I didn't say that. Instead, I nodded, letting her believe I understood her better than I did. If only I'd questioned her more. If only I'd noticed the way her eyes lingered on me, studying my reactions like a scientist observing a test subject. If only I'd realized that every story she wrote was a confession in disguise. But I didn't. I trusted her, completely and blindly. And for a while, that trust was enough to keep the cracks in our foundation hidden from view. Life in the laboratory was good, or so I thought. Pain makes people feel alive, Dylan, don't you think? That sentence stayed with me for days after. Claire said it. Pain wasn't something I'd ever craved. I liked stability, predictability, the quiet reassurance of knowing that the people I loved were safe and happy. But Claire, she seemed fascinated by chaos, drawn to the messiness of human emotions, like a moth to a flame. Her stories became increasingly bold after that. I remember the exact moment I noticed the shift. We were in our living room, the soft hum of the heater filling the silence, when she handed me a new manuscript, her eyes practically glowing with excitement. "Here," she said, sliding the pages into my hands. "This one's special." The title was The Slow Unraveling. I frowned at the name, but didn't say anything. Claire sat across from me, watching me as I read. The story was about a woman named Isabel who felt suffocated in her marriage. Her husband adored her, provided everything she could ever want, but his love felt more like a gentle cage than a home. Isabel wanted something dangerous, something that made her heart race. And so she let herself fall into an affair with a charming stranger, a man who made her feel seen in a way her husband never did. The story ended with Isabel sitting at her kitchen table, staring into her husband's eyes, pretending she'd never betrayed him. It was haunting, beautiful, and gut-wrenchingly sad. When I reached the last page, I couldn't speak right away. My chest felt tight, as though Isabel's pain had become my own. I looked up at Claire, searching her face for some kind of reassurance. "It's powerful," I said finally, "but does it have to be so cruel?" Claire's smile was soft but unreadable. "Sometimes cruelty is the only honest emotion." Her words unsettled me. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was telling me something more than just her thoughts on writing. But I pushed the discomfort down, choosing to believe that Claire was just immersed in her work. The next few months were a blur of late-night readings and quiet moments where I tried to decipher Claire's stories like they were riddles. Each one seemed to circle back to betrayal, different names, different places, but the same theme. The unfaithful wife, the oblivious husband, the bittersweet lie that held everything together until it fell apart. I hated those stories, but I also couldn't stop reading them. One night, after finishing a story titled The Shoreline Pact, I finally spoke up. "Claire, do you ever worry that these stories are too personal?" She looked up from her glass of wine, eyebrows raised. "What do you mean?" "They feel real," I said slowly, "almost like you're writing from experience." Claire laughed, a bright, easy sound that felt almost rehearsed. "Dylan, they're fiction, don't be ridiculous." But was I? I didn't know any more. All I knew was that her stories were starting to feel like pieces of something larger, something hidden beneath the surface. A week later, Claire brought me another manuscript. This one was different. It wasn't just another story. It was the most intimate thing she'd ever written. I could tell before I even opened it. There was something in the way she handed it to me, something almost reverent. "I want you to be honest," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Tell me exactly what you think." I nodded and began to read. The story was called The Unspoken Confession. It was about a wife who confessed her infidelities to her husband, not through words, but through actions disguised as fiction. She wrote him story after story, each one mirroring her real-life betrayals. The wife watched as her husband read, gauging his reactions, feeding off his pain. The husband never realized the truth. He thought he was reading fiction. In the end, the wife walked away, leaving the husband alone with nothing but the echoes of the lies she'd told. I felt a chill run down my spine as I reached the final paragraph. The words seemed to blur on the page. My hands trembled slightly. As I closed the manuscript and looked up at Claire, her eyes were locked on mine, wide and searching. She was holding her breath, waiting for my reaction. "Claire!" My throat felt dry. This feels too real." Claire's smile was small and sad. "Why do you think that?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I didn't know what to say. Was this a story, or was it a confession? That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I replayed every story she'd ever written in my head, fitting the pieces together like a puzzle. The characters, the timelines, the tiny details that felt eerily familiar. Was Claire trying to tell me something, or was I losing my mind? I turned to look at her sleeping form, her face peaceful in the moonlight. For the first time in our marriage, I felt a strange, hollow distance between us, a gap I wasn't sure I could ever close. The stories weren't just fiction. I could feel it in my bones, but I wasn't ready to confront the truth. Not yet. For now, I stayed in the shadows, waiting, watching, and hoping that I was wrong. Sleepless nights became my new normal after that. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that I was overthinking everything. Claire had always been passionate about her work. She thrived on emotions, both her own and those of the people around her. Surely her stories were nothing more than reflections of her creative process. And yet, something inside me was changing. A small but relentless whisper that kept asking the same question over and over: what if it's not fiction? The next morning, Claire was her usual self, cheerful, humming as she made coffee, talking about her plans for the day. She was so effortlessly normal that it almost made me doubt my doubts. "Dylan," she called from the kitchen, "can you believe I've been invited to that writer's retreat in Napa next weekend? It's a dream come true." "Another trip?" I tried to sound supportive, but the words tasted bitter in my mouth. Claire leaned against the doorway, holding her mug with both hands. Her hair was a mess of soft waves, and she had that glow, the one she always had before she left. "It's only for a few days," she said, as if reading my thoughts. "You'll be fine without me?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Of course. It's a great opportunity for you." But inside, my heart sank. The retreat came and went, just like the others. Claire returned with a stack of notes and a new idea for a story that she couldn't wait to share. She was buzzing with excitement as she handed me the first draft. "This one," she said, eyes bright, "is going to be my best yet." The title was simple but ominous. "Fragments of Us." I hesitated before opening it, a knot forming in my chest. The story followed a woman named Evelyn who had fallen in love with two different versions of herself, the devoted wife and the reckless lover. Evelyn convinced herself that she could be both, living two lives without consequence. But in the end, the weight of her secrets crushed her, and she was left standing alone in the wreckage of her choices. Every line felt like a confession. I read, the scenes became sharper, memories I couldn't quite place, but felt like I'd lived them. The way Evelyn described her husband's quiet loyalty, the way she justified her actions with phrases I'd heard Claire use before. I needed to feel something different. "It doesn't mean I don't love him." I put the manuscript down, my head spinning. Claire sat across from me, her face soft with anticipation. She loved watching my reactions, feeding off the emotions her stories stirred. "What do you think?" she asked, tilting her head. I struggled for the right word. "Personal." Claire's smile faltered. "For just a second, a blink and you miss it hesitation. Isn't that what makes it good?" she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Claire," I said slowly, "where do you get these ideas?" Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Why do you ask?" "Because—" I paused, weighing my words. "It's like you've lived them." For a heartbeat, the room was silent except for the hum of the heater. Claire's face didn't change, but I could feel something shift in the air between us, a crack in the surface. She laughed, but it was forced. "You're being silly." That night, after Claire had fallen asleep, I sat at the dining table with her manuscript spread out in front of me, like evidence in a crime scene. I began piecing together details, dates from her trips, places she'd mentioned, moments that had felt strange at the time, but hadn't seemed important enough to question. It was like watching a movie in reverse, where all the forgotten moments suddenly came into sharp focus. There was a story set in New Orleans. During Mardi Gras, Claire had gone to New Orleans 2 years ago for research. Another story took place at a coastal inn on the East Coast. Claire had stayed at a similar inn during another solo trip. And then there was the unspoken confession, the story that had started it all. The timeline matched perfectly with her trip to a writers' conference that I hadn't been able to join because of work, my hands clenched into fists. The next morning I couldn't keep quiet any longer. "Claire," I said as she was getting ready. She looked up from her suitcase, her hairbrush in hand. I hesitated, feeling the weight of my words pressing against my chest. "Are your stories really fiction?" Claire froze for a fraction of a second before forcing a smile. "What are you talking about?" "I mean it," I said, my voice firmer this time. "Some of the details, they're too close to real life." Her smile disappeared. "Dylan, you're overthinking things. Writers draw from life. It's how we create, but that doesn't mean it's real." I stared at her, searching for any sign of honesty or deceit. "Do you promise me that none of it happened?" Claire's gaze softened, and for a moment I thought I saw guilt flicker behind her eyes. But she reached out and placed her hand over mine. "I promise," she whispered. It should have comforted me. But instead, it felt like she was placing a bandage over a wound that was already infected. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the seeds of doubt had already taken root, and there was no way to unsee the truth that had started to bloom. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I realized something terrifying. Even if Claire had told the truth, I no longer trusted her. And that was the beginning of the end. Trust is fragile. It's not something that breaks with a single crack. It shatters slowly, piece by piece, until all that's left is dust. And by the time you notice, it's already too late. Claire handed me a new manuscript the morning after. Our confrontation. Her eyes were steady but wary, as if she sensed my lingering unease. "This one," she said softly, "is different." The title read, "The Final Masquerade." The name alone sent a chill down my spine. I took the manuscript, reluctantly, sitting down at the dining table while Claire poured herself a cup of coffee. The room was quiet, except for the sound of pages turning. The story was about a couple named Daniel and Lila. Lila was a writer, known for her hauntingly beautiful short stories, each one dripping with secrets. Daniel was her husband, a kind, gentle man who worshipped the ground she walked on. But there was something Daniel never realized. Every story Lila wrote was a truth in disguise. Each tale was a confession wrapped in fiction. Lila called them her masquerades, a way of revealing everything while keeping the truth hidden in plain sight. The climax of the story hit me like a punch to the gut. Lila finally confessed, not with words, but by handing Daniel her final manuscript, the one that laid everything bare, the affairs, the lies, the manipulations. It was all there, inked into every page. Daniel's world unraveled in slow motion as he realized the woman he'd loved had used his trust as the foundation for her deception. I slammed the manuscript shut, my heart pounding in my chest. The walls of the room felt like they were closing. In around me, Claire was watching me, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. "Well?" she asked, her voice carefully casual. I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. Is this a joke?" Her brow furrowed. "Dylan," I cut her off, my voice louder than I'd intended. "Why do you keep writing this same story over and over? It's the same thing every time, a wife, a husband, betrayal. Why?" Claire set her mug down slowly. "Because it's compelling." "No." I shook my head, stepping closer. "Because it's real." Her eyes widened, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she folded her arms across her chest like she was bracing for impact. "Just tell me the truth," I said, my voice breaking. "Is that what this is? Is this our life you've been writing about all along?" Claire's gaze dropped to the floor. She didn't speak for several seconds, and those seconds felt like years. "Dylan," she finally whispered, "you don't understand." "Then help me understand," I practically shouted. "I need to know." Claire took a slow, trembling breath. I never meant for it to happen like this." My heart sank. That wasn't a denial, it was an admission. I felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. I stumbled back a step, gripping the edge of the table for support. "How long?" I whispered. Claire hesitated. "It started a few years ago." I clenched my fists, trying to keep myself from unraveling. "How many?" She looked up at me and her eyes were filled with something I couldn't quite name. Regret, guilt, maybe even relief. "2," she whispered. "2 affairs. 2 betrayals that she had immortalized in her stories while I sat beside her, completely oblivious." "I didn't do it to hurt you," Claire said, stepping closer, her voice pleading now. "I needed something real, Dylan. Something raw. My stories, they needed authenticity." I stared at her, disbelief washing over me like a tidal wave. "So you used me?" "No." Claire reached for me, but I took a step back. "I love you, don't you see that? You're the only reason any of it matters. Your emotions, your reactions, they made the stories real." I felt sick. "You wanted me to feel pain so you could write better stories?" She didn't respond. And in that silence, I found my answer. I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to make sense of the chaos in my mind. The memories of every story, every reading session, every trip she'd taken, it all swirled together into a storm that threatened to tear me apart. "All this time," I murmured. "You watched me cry over your stories. You saw me break. And you enjoyed it." Claire's face crumpled. "No, Dylan, I didn't enjoy your pain. I was inspired by your strength." "Strength?" I laughed bitterly. "You didn't make me stronger, Claire. You broke me." Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, she looked small, like the weight of her actions had finally caught up to her. "Please," she whispered. "I never wanted to lose you." I met her gaze, and for a split second, I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman who used to make me feel like I was her whole world. But now, I wasn't sure if that woman had ever truly existed or if she'd just been another one of Claire's creations. I didn't say anything else. I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. I walked past her, grabbed my coat, and stepped outside. The cold air hit me like a slap, but it wasn't enough to numb the pain. My mind replayed the scene over and over, the confession, the lies, the way her stories had been built on the ruins of our life. I didn't know if I was coming back. I didn't know if I could ever forgive her. All I knew was that the man who had walked into that room wasn't the same man who had walked out. Some things break and can never be put back together. The street outside was empty, the sky a dull shade of grey, as though even the heavens were uncertain whether to rain or clear. The cold wind stung my skin, but it didn't compare to the ache in my chest. I kept walking, trying to outrun the memories clawing at me from every direction. I wasn't sure where I was going. I just knew I couldn't be there. Not with her, not in that house full of stories that had been feeding off my life like a parasite. I stopped at the park, where Claire and I used to have lazy Sunday picnics. The bench by the old oak tree was empty, just like I felt. I sat down and let the silence surround me. The unraveling, I closed my eyes, and the memories came rushing back. Claire's laughter, her voice reading the opening lines of her stories, the way she'd look at me, waiting for my reaction. Had every smile been a lie? Had she been watching my heart break and thinking, this will make a great chapter? I took out my phone without thinking and stared at her name in my contacts. Part of me wanted to call her and scream. Another part of me wanted to hear her voice one more time, to pretend none of this had happened. Instead, I put the phone back in my pocket and buried my face in my hands. "Dylan?" The voice was soft, familiar. I looked up and saw Claire standing a few feet away, her coat pulled tight around her shoulders. Her eyes were red, and for the first time, she didn't look like the vibrant, confident woman I knew. She looked scared. I wanted to tell her to leave, but the words stuck in my throat. She sat down at the other end of the bench, leaving space between us. "I didn't follow you to fight," she said quietly. I need you to hear me." I let out a hollow laugh. "Hear you? Claire, all I've done for 10 years is listen to you, your stories, your confessions disguised as fiction. And I believed in you every single time." Claire winced, as though my words had physically hurt her. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." "Then what was it supposed to be?" I asked bitterly. "An experiment? A way to test how much I could take before I broke?" She shook her head fiercely. "No, I wrote those stories because I didn't know how else to tell you what I was feeling. Every time I wrote about a betrayal, it was like a part of me was trying to scream for help. I didn't want to hurt you. I wanted you to understand me." My heart twisted painfully. "Claire, there are 1,000 ways to ask for help. You didn't have to destroy us." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I thought you'd hate me if you knew the truth." "I hate you now," I whispered, and her face crumpled. "Because you didn't trust me enough to be honest." She wiped her eyes, her hands trembling. "Do you know what it's like to feel invisible, Dylan? To be loved but never really seen?" I felt a flash of anger. "I saw you, Claire. I saw all of you, the writer, the dreamer, the romantic. I loved every version of you." She shook her head. "You loved the version of me that fit your life, the Claire who made you feel safe." I clenched my jaw. "No, I loved you, the real you. But you never gave me the chance to know who that was." Claire looked away, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The distance between us felt like a canyon, impossible to cross. Finally, Claire spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, Dylan. I let the words hang in the air. I'd waited so long to hear them, but now that I had, they felt empty. I don't think I can forgive you," I said, my voice breaking. "Not because you cheated, but because you made me part of your lies. You took something sacred and made it a spectacle." Claire wiped her eyes and nodded slowly. "I know." I stood up, the weight of everything pressing down on my shoulders. "I don't know what happens next," I said, more to myself than to her. Claire looked up at me, her face pale. "I don't either." For the first time, she didn't have a story to fall back on. There was no neat ending, no clever twist to explain away the mess. The walk away, I walked away, leaving Claire on that bench beneath the old oak tree. She didn't call after me, didn't try to stop me. Maybe she knew there was nothing left to say. As I walked, I felt an overwhelming sense of loss, not just for Claire, but for the life I thought we had. The man I'd been when I believed in her was gone, and I wasn't sure who was left in his place. I wanted to believe that I'd wake up and this would all have been a bad dream. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I knew the truth. This was real. The house felt different when I walked through the door. It wasn't just empty, it was hollow, like every memory we'd made together had drained out of the walls, leaving behind nothing but silence. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. For a long time, I just stood there, unsure of what to do. The living room was exactly as we'd left it that morning, the manuscript still, lying on the table like a loaded gun. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. I didn't want to touch it, but it felt like it was staring back at me, daring me to open it again and relive the betrayal one more time. I made it to the couch before my legs gave out beneath me. My body felt heavy, like gravity was stronger in that room. I buried my face in my hands, trying to quiet the storm of thoughts crashing inside my head. How could she do this? How could she love me and still destroy me at the same time? I thought of the first time I met Claire, her bright laughter, the way she made everything seem more alive. She was magnetic, irresistible. I was hooked from the start, too blinded by love to see the danger signs. And now I wasn't sure if I'd ever really known her at all. I glanced around the room. and every object felt like it had turned against me. The photos on the mantel, our honeymoon in Santorini, that road, trip to Big Sur, Claire's book signing, where she'd kissed me in front of the crowd. They weren't memories anymore. They were lies in frames, reminders of a life I'd built on sand. I grabbed the nearest photo frame and almost hurled it across the room, but I stopped myself. What was the point? Shattering a picture wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't erase what she'd done. Instead, I placed it face down and turned away. The my phone buzzed in my pocket, snapping me out of my haze. I pulled it out and stared at the screen. Claire's name lit up, and for a second, my heart betrayed me. A part of me wanted to answer, to hear her voice, to believe she'd somehow make this all okay. But another part of me knew better. I let it ring. When the ringing stopped, the silence felt heavier. A notification popped up, one new voicemail. I hesitated, then pressed play. Claire's voice came through, soft and strained. "Dylan, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but please, just listen. I'm not calling to beg for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. I don't know what's wrong with me or why I ruin the things that mean the most, but you were the best part of my life. I'm so sorry. I hope you believe that." The voicemail ended with a soft click, and I sat there staring at the screen until it went dark. Claire's words echoed in my head, but they felt hollow. "I never stopped loving you." What kind of love was that? The kind that betrayed, lied, and left scars you couldn't see? I stood up and paced the room, trying to shake off the crushing weight of it all. I opened the fridge out of habit, looking for something, anything to distract myself. But all I saw were the leftovers Claire had made the night before. Pasta primavera, one of her favorites. It felt like a cruel joke. I slammed the fridge shut, my hands trembling. I needed to get out of there. The house felt haunted, every room filled with echoes of Claire's laughter and the ghosts of who we used to be. I grabbed my jacket and headed outside again, walking aimlessly down the street. The air was sharp and cold, but I barely felt it. I just needed to keep moving, to stay ahead of the tidal wave of pain that threatened to pull me under. I walked past familiar landmarks, our favorite coffee shop, the bookstore where we'd spent lazy Sundays browsing shelves, the park where we used to sit and watch the world go by. Every step felt like walking through the wreckage of a life that no longer existed. I stopped at a corner and leaned against a lamppost, struggling to catch my breath. My vision blurred, and I felt like I was floating outside my body. Is this real? Or am I still stuck in one of her stories? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Had Claire manipulated me so deeply that I couldn't tell reality from fiction anymore? "Hey, are you okay?" The voice startled me. I turned to see a middle-aged man in a coat, his expression filled with concern. I forced a weak nod. "Yeah, I'm fine." The man didn't look convinced. "You sure? You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed at the irony. Instead, I just nodded again. "Thanks, but I just need some air." He hesitated before walking away, glancing back once before disappearing down the street. I stood there, for what felt like hours, trying to pull myself together, but the truth was like a blade lodged in my chest. I couldn't move forward without bleeding out. Claire's betrayal wasn't something I could forgive or forget. It had changed me, carved out a part of me that I wasn't sure would ever grow back. As I walked home in the fading light, I realized something that terrified me more than anything else. I wasn't just mourning the loss of Claire. I was mourning the man I used to be, the man who believed in love, in loyalty, in the simple goodness of the life we'd built. That man was gone, and I wasn't sure who would take his place. When I reached the front door, I hesitated before stepping inside. The house was still there, waiting, but it didn't feel like home anymore. I crossed the threshold anyway, knowing that the hardest part of this story wasn't over. Not yet. The house was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that hums with the weight of everything unsaid. I closed the door behind me and stood there, listening to the nothingness. Claire wasn't home. I'd half expected her to be sitting on the couch, waiting to say something, anything, to change how things were. But she wasn't. Maybe she knew there was no fixing this. Maybe she needed space as much as I did. My eyes drifted to the stack of manuscripts still sitting on the table. They looked innocent, just paper and ink. But I knew better. Those pages weren't just stories. They were pieces of my life carved out and twisted into something unrecognizable. I picked up the top one, The Final Masquerade. My chest tightened as I read the first few lines again. To the one who always believed in me, even when I didn't deserve it. My throat burned as I read the dedication. I dropped the pages back onto the pile as though they'd caught fire. The unexpected arrival. The sound of a car door closing outside snapped me out of my haze. I walked to the window and pulled the curtain back just in time to see Claire stepping out of her car. She was holding a small duffel bag in one hand. My heart sank. She was leaving. She walked up the path slowly, her face pale and expressionless. When she opened the door and saw me standing there, her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't think you'd be here," she whispered. I crossed my arms, trying to steady myself. "I live here." She flinched at the sharpness of my tone, but nodded. "Right." She set the bag down by the door and looked at me, searching my face for something. "I'm going to stay at a hotel for a few days." I stared at her, waiting for the familiar surge of anger. But it didn't come. I just felt tired. "Running away?" Claire blinked, and a single tear slid down her cheek. "I'm not running," she said softly. I don't want to make this harder for you." "For me?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Claire, you made it harder the moment you decided I was part of your experiment." She nodded slowly as if agreeing with me. "You're right, I did." The final conversation. Claire took a hesitant step forward, closing some of the distance between us. "I never wanted it to end like this, Dylan." "Then what did you want?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Did you want me to read your stories forever, oblivious, while you wrote your way through every lie? Were you ever going to tell me the truth?" Claire's face crumpled. "I wanted you to understand me without me having to say it out loud. I thought, if I wrote it, if you felt it through the stories, maybe you'd see who I really was." I shook my head. "You didn't give me a chance to know the real you. You hid behind your stories and waited for me to put the pieces together." Her tears came faster now, because I was scared. Of what? Of losing you. My heart ached at the raw honesty in her voice. But it was too little, too late. "You lost me the second you chose fiction over our life." I took a deep breath, forcing the words out. "We could have had something real, Claire. But now, I don't even know what's real anymore." Claire wiped her cheeks, her hands shaking. "I love you, Dylan." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sound of her voice. I used to believe that. When I opened my eyes again, I saw the defeat in hers. Claire wasn't fighting anymore. She'd finally accepted that there was no saving us. She stepped forward and reached out, her fingertips brushing against my hand. "You were the best part of my life," she whispered. I didn't move. I couldn't. The weight of everything held me in place. Claire's hand lingered for a moment before she let it fall. She picked up her bag and walked toward the door. When she reached it, she paused. "Goodbye, Dylan." Her voice was barely audible, but it cut deeper than anything else she'd said. I stood there as she stepped outside and closed the door behind her. The sound of it felt final, like the closing chapter of a story I didn't want to be a part of anymore. I stayed by the window, watching as Claire walked to her car and drove away. I waited until her taillights disappeared down the street before I finally let myself collapse onto the couch. The house was silent again. But this time, the silence felt permanent. I leaned back and closed my eyes, letting the weight of everything settle over me. This was the end of us. And even though I knew I'd wake up tomorrow, even though I knew life would go on, a part of me would always be stuck here in the ruins of what we once were.